Yes, Europe is a garden. The rest of the world, most of the rest of the world is the jungle. And the jungle could invade the garden. And the gardeners should take care of it.
Remember this? That was Joseph Borrell, the head of the European Union's foreign policy. What did he mean? Where does this supposed garden begin and end? Well, look no further than the northwestern tip of the African continent. There we find a 7-mile long, 10-foot high razor wire fence surrounding the Spanish enclave city of Ceuta, the boundary between the garden and the jungle. Facing the Strait of Gibraltar, Ceuta and neighbouring Melilla are the only remaining African territories belonging to a European state. In June 2022, at least 37 people were killed as they tried to scale Melilla's border fence, a massacre for which there is yet to be a credible investigation. Spanish and Moroccan police fired rubber bullets, used tear gas and threw rocks that left hundreds injured, while Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez accused the dead of violating Spain's territorial integrity. The EU pays Morocco for this service, $234 million between 2015 and 2021, to police with deadly force the border between the garden and the jungle, to patrol the edges of Fortress Europe. This deadly Fortress Europe has been under construction for decades. In 1990, the members of the European Community signed the Dublin Convention, which shifted responsibility for processing asylum claims from the country where the asylum seeker claimed asylum to the first member country that the person had entered. The Convention effectively moved responsibility to the EU's southern and eastern borders, fueling their fortification and undermining the concept of responsibility sharing, originally outlined in the UN's 1951 Refugee Convention. The system was designed, according to Brussels, to limit the secondary movements of applicants for international protection between member states. In 2001, the Convention was criticised as going against the principles of responsibility sharing and solidarity. The border fences surrounding Ceuta and Melilla, the same border fences where migrants are now massacred, were put up following the Dublin Convention. In 1993, just 18 people were removed from Ceuta and Melilla. By 1995, that figure had risen to more than 15,000. Then Spain's Interior Minister promised to seal off the border. And that's when the EU began to sign doorman deals with the governments of Turkey, Libya and other nearby non-EU countries. In exchange for aid, these countries would stop refugees at their borders. In 2018, for example, after receiving 80 million from Brussels, Turkey completed a 764-kilometre concrete wall along its Syrian border, closing one of the few remaining routes for those fleeing war. 35.6 million went to the private Turkish company Otokar for the construction of armoured vehicles that patrolled the Syrian border. The Turkish arms manufacturer Aselsan was paid 30 million to provide surveillance vehicles for the Greek border. In June 2023, 1 month after the European Parliament condemned the Tunisian government for its crackdown against trade unions, civil society, the independent judiciary, migrants and political opponents, Ursula von der Leyen, the unelected head of the European Commission, announced that the EU would pay Tunisia 100 million to control its borders. The EU's foreign aid is used to outsource migration control rather than development, and the results are deadly.
They're shooting again. So-called Libyan Coast Guard, don't shoot at the people.
Since 1993, over 50,000 have died at the hands of Fortress Europe policies. Each death is a tragedy, and they have accelerated since the EU's border forces were integrated in 2005 into an institution called Frontex. In 2022, Forensic Architecture, a research agency investigating human rights violations based at the University of London, revealed a systematic and illegal campaign to brutalise and abandon asylum seekers approaching Greek shores on the EU's southern border, committed with the silent consent and participation of Frontex and the EU. An investigation by Le Monde, Der Spiegel and others found that in the 18 months to September 21, Frontex had been involved in pushing back over 950 people in the Aegean Sea. Let's examine just one of these cases. On the 1st of March 2020, 65 asylum seekers were heading across the Mediterranean on an inflatable boat near the Greek island of Lesbos. They were spotted by Frontex guards. Soon an Hellenic Coast Guard patrol vessel attacked the migrants' boat, removing its engine and petrol tank and leaving it adrift. The group was later picked up by the Turkish Coast Guard off the coast of Babakale. Records from Frontex's own database, obtained through a Freedom of Information request, show at least 22 incidents in which asylum seekers were taken off dinghies, put into Greek life rafts and left adrift at sea. Fortress Europe turned the famous blue waters of the Aegean, the same sea that draws millions to Greece and its tourist economy, into one of the world's biggest graveyards. For those who survive the crossing, the violence does not stop. The policing of its waters is paired with a network of detention centres and open-air prisons that incarcerate those who reach Europe. When a fire swept through the Moria camp on the island of Lesbos in 2020 and left more than 10,000 people without shelter, the EU announced its intention to fund 5 new closed controlled access centres on the Aegean islands. Completed in 2021, Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis described the new centre on Samos as an impeccable camp with impeccable conditions. EU officials described those 5 new facilities as a new generation of refugee camps. Testimony from Samos says otherwise. Everyone is inside their container. Nobody comes outside. Everyone is depressed and sick in some way from loneliness, from their legal situation or status and other problems they have in their lives, says Mehdi, a 23-year-old Afghan. We refugees are not guilty criminals. We are human. We came here with hope. While keeping quiet about it, Europe is effectively following the Australian model by outsourcing detention to third countries and doing everything to keep migrants out. In 2020, the European Commission's new Pact on Migration and Asylum introduced a pre-entry screening that should apply to all third country nationals, formalising offshore detention. In Lebanon, Libya, Moldova and Mauritania, the EU has funded the construction of detention centres to further externalise Europe's borders. Fortified borders are a prerequisite for joining the European Union now. Candidate states must commit to protecting the garden from invasion. In the case of Albania, the nation's detention centre security must be upgraded. In North Macedonia, the EU has funded the construction of a new detention centre. Serbia's detention centre must be upgraded to fulfil European standards. What are these asylum seekers fleeing? War, conflict, insecurity, much of which was caused by the US and Europe in the first place. The wars in Afghanistan, Iraq and Libya still produce huge numbers of refugees. They're joined by the victims of climate breakdown, whose land has become unlivable due to carbon emissions that neither they, their parents nor their grandparents are responsible for. Now the EU, whose states contributed to the destruction of others' homelands, takes action to kill or imprison the humans fleeing those lands. How can Europe act with such barbarism? Well, we've been here before. In his seminal work, Discourse on Colonialism, the great Martinican thinker Aimé Césaire noted Europe's surprised and indignant reaction to the presence of fascism on the continent. They tolerated that Nazism before it was inflicted on them, wrote Césaire. They absolved it, shut their eyes to it, legitimised it, because until then it had been applied only to non-European peoples. Today we see across Europe the rise of a far right. Europe's political mainstream is surprised and indignant at the strength of these parties, but they shouldn't be allowed to wash their hands so quickly. It is Europe's mainstream parties, the parties of the so-called centre, the Christian Democrats, the Liberals, and yes, the Social Democrats, sharing power for decades, who have built this fortress Europe. They designed the policies, they wrote the laws, they awarded the contracts, they built the camps. It is they who describe Europe as a garden and the majority world as a jungle. And it is they who are the authors of the shocking, systemic violence doled out on EU borders every passing day against desperate, vulnerable people seeking safety and security. They have normalised it. It is their violence, the externalised violence of the EU and European states, that is breeding fascism at home.